my experience with talking at a meeting, there's going to be three people that walk out of this meeting, and one person on the left is going to be like, I really like that, what he had to say. And the guy on the right is going to be like, I really did not like what he said. And the guy in the middle is going to be like, what was he talking about? That's just how that goes, and that's fine. So right now, beforehand, I'm going to say thank you and you're welcome, depending on whichever side of the fence you fall on. I've covered you. I'm an alcoholic. My name is Tom. It's wonderful to be here tonight. It's always a privilege to be asked to do service in Alcoholics Anonymous, and it's truly a blessing. I'm truly grateful for being able to be here tonight. There is a story that I love better than mine, and it is the AA story, which I think of in my own head as the second greatest story ever told. Aldous Huxley, the author of Brave New World, called Bill Wilson the greatest social architect of the 20th century, and AA the greatest social invention. And I believe that. The fine print, I'm an alcoholic. My name is Tom Roach. My sobriety date is June 26th, 2001. Bill D, AA number 3 sobriety date. And my home group is the Central Fact Group. Some of you will recognize that from There's a Solution on page 25. And we meet at St. Ambrose Church on Federal Highway in Deerfield Beach on Friday nights at 7:30. And if you're looking for a meeting and you're in South Florida, we just started meeting again live a couple of weeks ago. Matter of fact, I just got to a live meeting for the first time to start another commitment. I just finished, I guess, a 5-week commitment on AA history, talking for an hour a night, or I guess 55 minutes. They had a couple of minutes of, and it took me 5 hours, 5 weeks to get Dr. Bob sober. And I know this is a Midwest meeting, and I'm sure that you'd like to get Bob sober. And so my commitment is that in a third of that amount of time, I'm going to, my commitment to you is that by the time we finish next Saturday night, both Bill and Bob will be sober, right? Which means that mostly this is going to be a process of deletion, of trying not to start a story that I don't have time to tell, because there's 1,000 AA stories, and I know a lot of them, and I love them, but we're just not going to have time for that. So this is going to be just a broad outline. If you're looking for history in the big book, when the first edition was written, what little history there is primarily in a vision for you. If we're looking at forward to the second edition that came out, 16 years later in 1955, we will see most of the history about Alcoholics Anonymous that's in the big book is in the forward to the second edition. And I always look at it as Bill's third talk. I'm sure a lot of people on this meeting have done a lot of speaking. I know Brian sure as hell has. And, there's always 3 talks. The talk you intend to give, by the way, I've been thinking about that talk the last couple of weeks. It was a pretty good talk. Unfortunately, that's not the one you're getting tonight. There's the talk you intend to give, there's the talk you give, and then there's the best talk, the talk you wish you gave when your head hit the pillow. So this is always the least of the 3 talks, but that's just the way it goes, and it lands where it lands, and that's okay. My apologies for not being in a tie. I know my sponsor would probably be in one, but he kept me on the phone too long for me to be on one. I called him thinking I would talk to him for a few minutes and wound up, like many times, talking to him for a long time. He's so damn interesting. And the best practitioner of AA principles that I ever met, Steps and Traditions. And he was a general service guy too, service. But he always reminds me, as he has said to me hundreds of times before I was about to do a talk, go read page 95. And what he means is read where it says, never talk down to an alcoholic from a moral or spiritual hilltop. Simply lay out the kit of spiritual tools for his inspection and show how they work for you. I'm not an authority on AA or the history or the big book or the Steps or Traditions or any of that. I'm here to share my experience as the best I understand it. And as Ryan said, if there's a core thing about the way I like to talk about the history, it encompasses exactly what Ryan said. One is I love it, but 2, to not have an agenda, to try to tell the truth. And Ryan, who has heard me tell the story of AA for over a decade, knows that I have changed certain things, that I have found out that I was wrong about certain facts that I thought were accurate, and I find out a deeper truth, and that there's something more accurate than what I was relaying. My sponsor laughs. I call it the plague of the old timers. People that sometimes get stuck in a story and they like the story so much that they won't leave it, even though we know it's no longer true. And so for the most part, I try not to have an agenda and just stick to the history of AA as best as I can tell it. And that's not to say that that's not going to change. Alcoholics Anonymous is an oral society, sober by anecdote. And by that very nature, it's not always completely factual and accurate. It changes. One of the things that I do, so I did it in that last group that I was in, but in whether we're doing a seminar in a hotel or if I'm doing a meeting like the last month, is an oral history is like this. If I hold up this dollar bill and you all look at it and I ask you to describe it to me, you're going to tell me about George Washington being on the front of it and everything else that you see. And then if you ask me what I see, I'm going to tell you about, well, the word one is on the back. There's no picture of any dead presidents or anything like that. Neither of us is wrong. We're both looking at it from a different perspective. And that's the way I look at oral history. So if you have an idea or some ideas about the way you think AA went, all I'm going to ask you to do is set that aside and just be open to what I'm going to say and know that I'm trying to represent the best truth and the most accurate that I know. And that being said, it's an oral society, sober by anecdote. So it's a matter of perspective and orientation. And we all have one, whether you like it or not. You come in here and you hear certain things, and that's what you generally repeat. I get nervous when I talk. I've always gotten nervous. Years ago, I developed something to get over that, which I call the lighter side. In the interest of time, I'm not going to do that. Maybe there are some newcomers on here. If you are, I'll just give you an idea. Like I said, I just spent the last hour talking to my sponsor and got him all straightened out. But let me how sponsor talks. My I've been sober for if I don't get run over by a cocaine delivery truck or drink, at the end of this month it'll be 20 years. And I come from a corporate background, a telecommunications background, and suit and tie. And I remember everybody said, don't go get a good job. Don't make a lot of money. You'll just go out and relapse again. Just humble yourself and do something. And I did. I got in a call center. And I remember after about 2.5 years, and I was so sick of that freaking job, just about to go crazy. And I called my sponsor and I said, hey, Charlie, I've been sober 2.5 years. When the hell am I going to get a good job? And the phone gets quiet for a second, the pregnant pause of sponsorship. And he goes, when you're ready. And I said, well, when will I be, how will I know when I'm ready? And he goes, when you have a new job. That's sponsor talk if you're new in recovery, right? And he's been great. God bless him. He saved my life 20 years ago. And I'm just so grateful for that. So what I'm gonna do first is jump into the Wayback Machine. Kind of one of the big major influences on Alcoholics Anonymous, and talk about the Washington Temperance Society, the Washingtonians, for a few minutes. They have nothing to do with the steps or the big book. Bill had never heard of the Washingtonians when he wrote the book and the steps, but they've got a lot to do with the traditions, right? Which are the glue that holds 12-step fellowships together. Without the steps, I'm not here tonight. Without the 12 traditions, none of us are here tonight. And I'm here mostly, I'm just going to talk about how AA landed on the planet. But, for those that have been around for a while, it's 3 legacies, right? Recovery, the 12 steps, which provide the solution, the tradition, unity, the 12 traditions, which protect that solution, and service, the 12 concepts, which provide the ideas, relationships, and responsibilities that continue to support the worldwide dissemination of that solution, right? That's the big picture of Alcoholics Anonymous. 3 corporations, the group conscience, which is the board of trustees, right? And then 2 publishing companies. Alcoholics Anonymous World Services publishes the big book and what we call General Service Conference of Group Books, and the AA Grapevine, which publishes the AA Grapevine and a couple other things, most notably the compendium of all Bill's Grapevine writings, Language of the Heart. So if you're new, that's kind of the big picture of what AA is. I'm here to share about how the hell we got here, okay? So we're gonna jump back in the Wayback Machine 180 years. It's Thursday night, it's April 2nd. We're on Liberty Road at Chase's Tavern in Baltimore, Maryland, and there's a half dozen of us, and we have a problem. We're drunks, we're alcoholics. And everybody on this call, I'm going to imagine, knows what that means to have problems with alcohol and drugs, right? So those guys are just sharing about that. They're losing their jobs, they're getting kicked out of the house, they're getting divorced, they're losing the family, the money, the car, the house. We all know how that goes. Their friends. And they're complaining about that. And what's going on in 1840 across the country? The temperance movement. And that night, there's a temperance talk. And they're like, well, why don't we go listen to what these guys are doing? Because they're stopping drinking, and some of them are saying that their lives are getting better. But they're good alcoholics. So what they do is they send 4 and 2 stay back so they can save the seats for those 4, and then over shits and giggles talk about what those funny stuff that those guys said at the talk, right? So the 4 guys come back and they say, you know what? These guys are, telling their stories about testimonies about they're getting back in their house, not just in the house, they're sleeping in the same bed with their wife. They got their kids back, they're keeping their jobs, right? They're not losing their house to foreclosure. Like, there's good things happening. Maybe we should, think about this stuff. And they start hashing out, well, what would that look like? And they're like, oh, we're tired of being talked to and talked down to by the clergy, by the judges, by the criminal justice system, even our, even our wives, telling us what to do, right? What about we just help each other? By the way, that's a radical idea. One layperson helping another, not a doctor, not a clergyman, not an educator, not a criminal justice judge or something. One layperson helping another. And we're not going to talk about politics or religion or any outside issue. We're just going to talk about alcoholism and what a problem alcohol is causing in our lives. And when we're here at the bar doing this for an hour, we're not going to drink. And then we're going to come back and meet next week at the same time. And between meetings, we're not going to drink. And if you know anyone else with a drinking problem, you can bring him back. OMG. That's a lot of the basic tenets of Alcoholics Anonymous, right? So what happens is they come back the next week and they meet, and this goes on for a few weeks. And the owner's wife of the bar says, hey, by the way, honey, all our best customers, they don't drink anymore. And not only are they taking up our seats, but they're bringing in more people that don't drink anymore. And if this goes on, we're going to go out of business. And they kicks them out. One of the guys is named Bill Mitchell. They start meeting at his house. They do that for a few weeks and quickly outgrow that. And before you know it, they're renting halls, right? This is in 1840. In 1842, they've got branches around the country. The guy that does their talk for the Illinois branch is a young state senator. His name is Abraham Lincoln, right? They're trying to get people that are well known to co-sign the movement, right? And they've got a lot of good ideas. There are various estimates, depending on what you read about AA history, that in 4 or 5 years, by the mid-1840s, their membership had grown to between 100,000 and 600,000. So let's split the difference, 250,000, 300,000 people, right? That's a big deal. In 6 years, how many people did we have? In 4 years, we have 100 when the book is published. In 6 years, there are 2,000, right? In 6 years, in 1941. These guys just take off like a rocket ship. And by 1848, they're done. They are extinct. Now, Bill Wilson, like I said, never heard of them when he wrote the book, but he did hear about them before the traditions, and they were a big influence on him about the traditions. There was a writer, Carl Sandburg, some of you would be familiar with, and what he said was, a civilization or society is doomed to perish that forgets where it came from. We talked about having a few 100,000 members in just a few years, but they forgot where they came from. The real estimates are that they had 1 to 6 million people that belonged to the Washington Temperance Society at that time, and only 10% of them were alcoholics. By then, it was friends and family and mostly children of the alcoholics. We often hear that they dissolved because of a tent tradition issue, getting involved in outside issues. It's certainly true. Not only the temperance movement, but the abolition of slavery. But we can also see three other traditions. The 11th tradition, associating with famous people. One of their big speakers was a guy named John Guff, found around the DC, Baltimore area, doing lots of talks, and then he gets drunk and pulls a Charlie Sheen. Oh, no names, right? Whereas he's on Johnny Carson one week talking about 12-step recovery and kites and butterflies and puppies and kittens and how his life has changed. And 3 weeks later, we see him on the front page of the National Enquirer, drunk out of his mind, addressed for drunken driving, right? And people say, what? Oh, that doesn't work. So we had that going on, but mostly we had a third and fifth tradition violation, which would have been the fifth tradition is a primary purpose. Each group has one primary purpose, to carry its message to the alcoholic who still suffers. Now they're talking, hey, guess what? 90% of the people aren't alcoholics. We love our stories. I'm sitting in the back row listening to some woman tell her story, and she's like drunk, talking about her third DUI. And there's a woman next to me or a guy next to me who at an open meeting is just an observer. And he says, what the hell's the matter with her? Why? She's going to lose her profession and her kids. Why doesn't she stop drinking? Me, I'm leaning over to my buddy, the other drunk, and saying, oh, that she gets a fourth. She's the real deal. She's getting another DUI. We love our stories. They're like, they don't get it, right? Oral Society, Sober by Anecdote, we chase tragedy into anecdote, and somehow, to the consternation of a world out there, emerge joyful. They don't get it. So the message is diluted, and now there's no membership requirement. The third tradition, the only requirement for AA membership is a desire to stop drinking. So there's no traditions, and that's the glue, as I said, that actually holds 12-step fellowships together. So Bill learns a lot about that in the early 40s, and that's going to be a big influence for in 1946, in the spring of 46, where at the urging of Earl Treat, his story's in your book, it's called He Sold Himself Short, he starts AA in Chicago. But at the urging of Earl Treat, he says, we've got to codify our experience and get this down in writing. By the way, since I'll never get to it, maybe I'll get to it. Maybe I'll do it right now. The traditions, although they're not written until the spring of 46, and then, in the fall of 49, 6 months prior to the International, Earl comes back and says, Bill, you got to shorten these. The fellowship doesn't like them. You're getting a lot of resistance. And we have the traditions the way many people just know the traditions on the short form, right? That was introduced at the 1950 World International in Cleveland and ratified by acclamation when they were recited by 6 guys. And then 3,000 people get to their feet and clap. And, Bill's like, those are the 12 traditions, having been so heard and hearing no objections, they're ratified. And that was it, right? But I'm going to just read to you the forward to the first edition, right? Forward to the first edition, the bottom paragraph, if you're on Roman numeral 13, it's just talked about anonymity, right? And now it says, we are not an organization in the conventional sense of the word, ninth tradition. There are no fees or dues whatsoever, seventh tradition. The only requirement for membership is an honest desire to stop drinking, right? Third tradition, right? We are not allied with any particular faith, sect, or denomination, sixth tradition, nor do we oppose anyone, 10th tradition. We simply wish to be helpful to those who are afflicted, fifth tradition. You can see the genesis of half of the traditions are already in place with 4 years of experience, even though they have not yet been codified. And later, we'll see you're all familiar with, we said at the beginning of this meeting, the Serenity Prayer. That's a paraphrase of that paragraph, which was adapted by Tom Y., the first editor of the Grapevine, that started in 1944. And in 1947, he realizes we need a definition of AA as we send out these grapevines to the wardens of hospitals and the medical directors of hospitals and the wardens of prisons at places where we show up and there's this new society. We need to have a definition of it. So we can see not the Serenity Prayer, the preamble. We can see the preamble and the genesis of the traditions all the way up in the first forward, just by experience, right? So the Washingtonians, they come and go, but Bill's got a lot that he learns about the traditions, which, thank you God, by the grace of God, which we're here today. So the next big movement that we would look at, and the primary influence for the actual formation of Alcoholics Anonymous, would start at the beginning of the 20th century. So now we're in Philadelphia, and it's 1908. And there's a Lutheran minister by the name of Frank Bookman, and he starts this hostel hospice type thing for young boys, underserved men who are underprivileged and who have great need. And it comes on his heart. He is just moved by this. And he starts taking care of this and, has pretty much found his life's work. And what happens is the board of directors, there's financial problems, economic problems in society. And the board of directors cuts his budget for his youth hostel. And he gets really pissed. I think we call it a resentment in AA, right? So much so that he leaves on bad terms with that board of directors. He's a minister, but he's a lost minister. He's a man on a mission without a mission. Winds up finding himself over in Keswick, England, at some evangelical convention. And he wanders off from the main speaker, some guy, and he hears this woman doing a small talk on the outskirts of the convention conference about first century Christianity. Jessie Penn Lewis was her name. First century Christianity, about sacrifice, surrender, right? He gets so moved, and forgiveness, sacrifice, surrender, and forgiveness. He is so moved by this talk that he has what we would call a classic conversion spiritual experience. And he writes letters of apology as forgiveness comes on his heart to all those board of directors that he had left on such bad terms. Today we would call that what? Letters of amends. He feels such a new relief and a new release and a new freedom from that process that he feels that he may have tapped into the solution for mankind. Forgive everyone, everything. And I don't know how far off that is. Not only can I make the case that the Oxford Group is founded on the back of the 8th and 9th steps, but I can make the same case for AA and Dr. Bob's sobriety date, which we celebrate next Wednesday as the sobriety date for the entire fellowship, right? That's founded on the back of his making amends that day. We'll try to get to that next week. And so he has such an experience. So we'll fast forward a few years. In 1918, he's on a trip, one of these missionary trips, evangelizing this newfound, Christianity that he's found over in China. And he runs into a guy on a YMCA mission whose name is Sam Shoemaker. If Frank Bookman is to be the CEO of a worldwide movement called the Oxford Group eventually, Sam Shoemaker is going to be like the president of the U.S. division. And he's the rector at the Episcopal Calvary Church in New York City. And he brings this idea of first century Christianity of sacrifice and surrender and forgiveness that Bookman is, proselytizing. And he brings that back to New York, right? In 1921 is when we consider the beginning of this Oxford Group movement. Frank Bookman has developed a following around Europe, right? In 1928, he finds himself down in South Africa. And there's a bunch of students that have followed him from Oxford University that are following him around. And they would go down to the train yards and they would say to the conductor, hey, have you seen any of my buddies, the other students, from Oxford that are following, this guy, Frank Bookman? I think he's speaking in the next town. And they'd be like, yeah, they're in the third car. No, they're in the seventh, they're in the 11th. They get tired of doing that. So one of the conductors has this idea, I'm just going to make up a placard and write Oxford Group on it and put it on one of the rail cars so that all these students can find each other as they travel around following this guy, Frank Bookman. The South African press, newspapers, see that Oxford Group and they start running with it. And the name gets usurped from First Century Christian Fellowship to what we know today as the Oxford Group. That's how it gets named, right? And there's some other theories about that. That's the one that I like the best. It seems to make the most sense to me at this time, right, tonight. Right? Tune in next year, we'll see. So they start following him around. The Oxford Group is a big movement. Frank Bookman is involved, once again, just like the Washingtonians, with getting famous people to like go along with the movement, right? And because that helps it, the association. And he's meeting with chancellors and prime ministers around the world and doing meetings in Madison Square Garden. And Sam Shoemaker's back in the United States working in primarily in New York, right? So now we can go back to the big book, right? In the big book, on at the end of There's a Solution on page 26, it says a certain American businessman. That businessman is a guy named Roland Hazard, right? Of the Hazard family of Rhode Island, a rich industrialist family. He is destined to inherit the dynasty, right? But he doesn't. His younger brother becomes president of the company. Why? Because Roland's like us. Roland's a drunk, right? And you don't hand the business over to your drunk son. You hand it over to your sober son, even if he's younger, right? And we'll see that experience repeated, right? William James, he had a brother that was now. Anyways, I get ahead of myself. So Roland Hazard, what we see in that story is Roland Hazard going over. Now, the way Bill Wilson used to tell the story is that Roland Hazard goes over to, Europe in 31 and 32 and gets with Carl Jung and studies with him for a year, right? That's not true. We know that today. And the reason we know that is because the Hazard diaries are basically at Brown University. There's been a lot of research since then. Wally P. really dug into that, back to basics. I should mention that, I guess. So I'm talking about Roland Hazard. I'm just going to jump back for a second. I should have said this in the intro. That thing about not having an agenda, and I call it the plague of the old timers. They get stuck in a thing. One of the reasons I'm agendaless is because I've had a lot of great influences. My sponsor, Charlie H, sponsored by Clancy, sponsored by Chuck C. You can't be sponsored by Charlie without getting Chuck all over you. That's just how it is. And but my big book mentor, at the same time I'm going through the steps in year one with my sponsor, I have a big book mentor, Jim Bramble, sponsored by Admiral Bud Skolnick, sponsored by Bill Wilson. So my step sponsor goes up, to my great grand sponsor Chuck out in the West Coast on California, and my big book mentorship goes to my great grand sponsor Bill in New York. And then I'm 3 years sober. I get to Joe and Charlie. I'm already a line by line big book thumper out of Bill's family, right? And that negative at first, because I'm looking at them like, oh, there's a lot of stuff they don't know or they missed or whatnot. And that's in the first 2 days of the seminar. And then after going through the second 2 days, I realized that, hey, it takes me 6 months to cover what those guys just did in a few days. They can't cover everything, Tom, just like I need to leave a lot of stuff out tonight. What they got done over a course of a weekend to help literally hundreds of thousands of people still blows my mind to this day, right? And then what I did is I got real interested. I noticed a lot of big book thumpers and they know their family. It could be Joe and Charlie out of the Midwest. It could be Plymouth House out of New Hampshire. It could be Primary Purpose out of Texas. Big Book Step Study out of Hyannis, Massachusetts. Wally P. Back to Basics. I'm familiar with lots of them. One of the very first retreats I went to was the Came to Believe retreat. That's me going through the steps through Clarence's sponsees, right? So I've done that. Been recruited by Primary Purpose to run their big book studies, done the Joe and Charlie big book seminar since I first saw them alive, did the Wally P. Back to Basics, did soul surgery out of England, which was England Oxford group, and with primary influences being Akron, Cleveland, and Chuck out of California. That was all 15 years ago. Like, I did a lot of research into a lot of groups and a lot of conferences and a lot of retreats to study many different approaches to AA. And what I got out of that was not only did I learn a lot, but I didn't get stuck. I didn't get stuck in the thinking that this is the way. The biggest challenge that all of those groups have is people being there for decades and thinking they have the way. Just talking to my sponsor a few minutes ago, I was talking about being at a meeting where a guy's telling him, a guy is saying to the group, to the meeting, and by the way, if your sponsor is doing this or isn't doing that, you need to get a new sponsor. It's like, oh my God, are you kidding me? People ask me all the time how you go through the steps because they're doing so many big book studies and step series. And my answer is always the same. The way the way your sponsor takes you through the steps. My hope is that it coincides with AA literature. But, I'm not here to tell anybody how to do this stuff, right? I'm just here sharing my experience. And oh my God, I remember where I left off, Roland Hazard. So on the top of page 26, a lot of you have no idea what a miracle that is. I went to an automobile accident a few years ago without a car, and I woke up at a trauma center having been run over by a car going 50 miles an hour. So I couldn't walk or talk for a little while. So the fact that I can remember anything is, by the grace of God, a miracle. So Roland Hazard, just for those that are, if we have any real history drillers in here, the podium is aware that in 31 and 32, Roland didn't have that type of time. He wasn't visiting over there with Carl Jung at the time. It probably happened in 1926. Amy Bloom, Cora Finch, there have been people who have done the studies, PhDs, they went out and did the research. And it wasn't a year, and it wasn't the right time. But the flavor of the story is right. He went over and studied with Carl Jung, right? He also was heavily influenced by the Emmanuel movement and Courtney Baylor. It doesn't matter. Don't let it distract from the story. Learning a fact here or a fact there that's maybe a little different than what you thought it was, right? So I'm going to paraphrase what happens on page 26 and 27. So it says about Roland Hazard, it says he believed he had acquired such a profound knowledge of the inner workings of his mind and its hidden springs that relapse was what? Unthinkable. And what's the next line? Nevertheless, he was drunk in a short period of time. And the story goes that, Carl Jung had first, and I'm going to tell this story. I'll qualify in a minute. That he wanted to see Freud, and that Freud was too busy, and that he didn't get to see Freud. And if that's true, it's one of the first big breaks that AA ever got. Freud was the father of psychoanalysis and dream psychology. The founding triumvirate of modern psychiatry is Freud, Adler, and Jung. If he had gotten with Freud, I'd be talking to you right now on a hangover from last night, telling you about a dream I had, and in my dream I was sober, right? Freud and Adler think that the body, the human being, is made up of a certain amount of instinct, right? A couple dollars worth of chemicals and a little bit of intellect, but not Carl Jung. Carl Jung is a believer. Above Carl Jung's transom, it says God is present, invoked or not invoked, And as it talks about the archway, walking through that archway for step 3, the construction metaphor in the big book. A friend of mine who talks about that says on the on the front of the arch it says choose. Are you in or you out? Well, as you come through the back of the arch, it says you have been chosen, right? Once you make a decision to be in this thing, right? Everybody walks in on the fear and fellowship of step 1. Whole second fellowship of the Spirit, 2 through 12, different requirements, right? So the reason I like that story is because it shows us what a break that Roland, Bill's grant sponsor, got with Carl Jung rather than Freud. Even though I don't believe that he would have gotten with Freud or was trying to, there's nothing really to back that up. And Freud was probably too busy doing coke, right? Oh, wait a minute. I don't know if that's true. Oh no, history says he was doing coke, and he was doing it then, right? So I know about that. So he was busy, right? So he leaves there, and he's on his way home, and he stops in Paris and to visit some of his family's wealthy friends. And somebody asks him the wrong question. Would you like a drink? And he toasts his newfound sobriety. So again, if you're new, yeah, Brian, that's a bad way to celebrate your sobriety, right? And he's off on a jag. But what's important is that he comes back. Again, this is from 26 and 27. I'm just paraphrasing it, colorizing it. He comes back to Carl Jung and says, hey, yo, dog, I need to do some more of that rehab, right? And Carl Jung says, no, I misdiagnosed you. I thought that you had profound psychological problems, but it's so much worse. You're a chronic alcoholic, and I've got nothing. He says, my art has failed you. And Roland pleads with him. No, this is the only time I've been sober. And Carl Jung says, no. My art, psychiatry, medicine, treatment have failed you. He said, but I've heard that here and there, now and then, there is this benign lightning that strikes people, but nobody can say where it will strike, and nobody can say when it will strike, and nobody can say for whom it will strike. But you need to put yourself in some type of environment where you might receive that type of lightning strike, some type of religious or spiritual movement, right? And Roland Hazard relaxes and says, yo, that's cool. I'm in church. I'm a regular churchgoer and whatnot. And Carl Jung looks at him and says, in your case, that's insufficient. How the hell does Carl Jung know that? I have a lot of theories and opinions in AA, but I'm a source guy. I can back them up. And I call it, the theory of the practical agnostic. Everybody arrives here a practical agnostic. And what I mean by that is, regardless of your faith and how deep and what or where you believe, it's been insufficient for you to stay sober. Otherwise, you wouldn't be standing in front of me asking me for help. So, I never say to the guy, no, don't do that. That doesn't work. It could be Catholic, Jewish, Episcopal, whatever he is. I'm like, no, we're going to do something over here that's going to help you stay sober. And by the way, I'm going to encourage you to continue over there. I don't actually think that they want you drinking and drugging either, right? So there's no conflict, right? The idea that Roland Hazard would come back to the United States and get involved in the Oxford Group makes perfect sense. They're a huge movement at the time. He gets involved in New York, and who would he meet at the headquarters? The Episcopal Calvary Church, Sam Shoemaker. And he gets schooled in what's called the Oxford Group method. So we're not going to go there right now, but I'm going to just, on Roman numeral 16, which is the second page of the foreword to the second edition, Bill Wilson talking about Bill, and it says, although he could not accept all the tenets of the Oxford Group, meaning that the four absolutes, we'll talk about that maybe for a minute next week, he did accept the need for what? Moral inventory, step 4, confession, step 5, restitution, step 6, helpfulness to others, step 12, right? 4 inventory, 5 confession, 12 helpfulness to others, 9 restitution, and then we have 11 belief in or guidance and direction from a higher power. So the steps that they're using are 4, 5, 9, 12, and 11. And the alcoholics inside the Oxford Group, which has nothing to do with alcohol, and it's just a first century Christian movement, and the alcoholics are making up a first step, which is we're licked by alcohol. So when people talk about the 6 steps of the Oxford Group, that's what they're talking about. 1, 4, 5, 9, 12, and 11. And we know that from the book. Bill told us that in 1955. He hadn't thanked the Oxford Group in 39 because there were some political problems with doing that, with Buckman being misconstrued in an interview that it sounded like he kind of favored some of what was going on with Hitler and Nazism. That's not exactly true, but the way it was misconstrued in the press, Bill knew enough about the traditions already in 1939 that would be that idea to put that in a book, which might turn some people off. But by 1955, he's in the process of saying thank you to people he hasn't thanked, right? It'll be another 6 years, he'll finally thank Carl Jung, right? In January of 61, right? For sending Roland Hazard to get a spiritual experience. Bill Wilson, I'll just close with this. We'll talk about the Oxford Group a little bit next week. No, we'll talk about that next week. That's it. My time is up. One of the nice things about doing a lot of talks for a lot of years is like when the hook is here, the hook is here. It's time to go, Tom. God bless you.